say it's lit, right? Lit, lit, lit.
You have a federal warrant for this address. Keep your hands up and follow orders. This is the FBI. We have a warrant for this.
They handcuffed me and my wife out here. They wanted me to sit on the curb while they were carrying this out, something that I refused to do. They wanted my wife to sit on the curb out here, that she refused to do.
As I was coming out, this big old drone met me.
The only revolutionary organization that's done something here on the ground practically for African people is the one that's come under attack. Institution that offers a community radio station, a newspaper, a commercial kitchen, an Aquaba Hall rental space, and community office for our organizers. That was the building that has come under attack.
You need a breach? What do you need?
Need one.
I don't know.
What's whole betterment money?
No,
thank you.
We will build a movement of white people that says hands off the Uhuru movement.
They see in the African People's Socialist Party a vanguard for the struggle for the liberation of our people. They see that because not just what we do here in the United States, but because we had the temerity to do like Garvey, to do like Malcolm X, and take the struggle of black people around the world.
Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, live with the leader of the African nation, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. The theme of our discussion is the history of African resistance. Over the last several weeks, we've discussed when revolution was the main trend in the world, with highlights of the Chinese and Vietnamese revolutions. We talked about the tremendous work of Marcus Garvey and the Garvey movement of the 21st century in the form of the African People's Socialist Party. Today, we're going to be discussing the history of African resistance, because there hasn't been a period since our introduction to the ruthless European colonizer that African people have ever stopped fighting to retrieve our freedom and dignity as a people. I will deliver an overview on the subject. Then we'll have the honor of bringing into this discussion the leader of the African People's Socialist Party and Uhuru movement, who carries with him the centuries worth of African resistance, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Before we start this overview, I want to encourage everyone watching to like, comment, and share, no matter what platform you're tuning in from. Discussions like these are critical for the masses of African, colonized, and all freedom-loving people to be engaged in. Now let's get to our overview. The history of African resistance and revolution. So first, we want to recognize Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who developed the theory of African internationalism, which is the theory, the worldview of the African working class, where we understand the world and the situation of Africans throughout it, understanding that we came into this relationship and we are colonized, dominated all over the world, and that this is the understanding that we have to be able to articulate and see the world as it actually is, that African people and the colonization of Africa, the theft of our resources and the dispersal of African people is what gave birth to the current world that we live in, this world that has been defined as existing under a colonial mode of production, which is what Chairman and African internationalism has helped us to understand. And being able to see the world through this lens allows us to turn history right side up. We've always understood the heroes. They've projected themselves, the white people, the colonizer have always projected themselves as the heroes, as the bringers of civilization to the entire world. And African internationalism has gone to set the record straight that the reality is that white people, the colonizer, Europe, and everywhere it is that the colonizer has positioned themselves are there as a consequence of what it is that they have done to African and other colonized people. So we have to be able to understand this, and thankfully the chairman, after all the history of resistance that we'll talk about, this history of African resistance and the struggles engaged by African people all throughout the world since we came under colonial domination has brought us to this point, has allowed for the chairman to come to this understanding, and now has provided the blueprint for Africans to achieve our freedom once and for all. So I want to recognize and salute the profound leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the theory of African internationalism, and the building of the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International, which is the vehicle which will deliver the final death blow to the colonial mode of production. And of course, we want to mention that, and as we just saw in this video, that the African People's Socialist Party and Uhuru movement came under attack by the United States government in the form of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which conducted a simultaneous pre-dawn raid on July 29th of this year, where they attacked Chairman Omali Yeshitela, Deputy Chair Azania Yeshitela, and other leaders of our movement, our institutions in St. Louis, in North St. Louis, and South St. Louis, and in St. Petersburg, Florida, South St. Petersburg. These were where the attacks were conducted. And, this was a really important exposing by the US government of their recognition of the success and the influence of the African People's Socialist Party, the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and the fact that the African People's Socialist Party represents the aims and aspirations of Africa, and that Africa is fixed in the middle of the whole world situation. And Africa commonly has been erased from history, has been removed from this process, but Africa plays a central component to the whole thing. The whole colonial mode of production gets its whole spine from Africa itself. The stolen African resources, including African people ourselves, make up the foundation of what we know as a colonial capitalist economy. The whole way of life for the colonizer, it rests in Africa and African people. And the African People's Socialist Party represents this trajectory of Africa freeing ourselves from the colonial mode of production. And this was a recognition, this attack was recognition by the US government that the African People's Socialist Party is leading that way forward. So when we talk about the history of African resistance culminating into this point on July 29, 2022, when they carried out this pre-dawn raid in these various locations, this is what they were attacking. They were attacking the struggle of African people to be free. They were attacking the righteousness of African resistance to our colonial domination when they attacked the Uhuru movement. So we have to be able to say this first, because as we talk about this history of African resistance, we have to understand that this is what they are attempting to squash our ability to be able to fight in our own interests, which automatically means that we are in resistance to the colonial mode of productions and the conditions that have been imposed on us through that process. So the FBI raid on the chairman, the party, and Uhuru movement of July 29th has helps us to set the context for the discussion that we're going to be having today. The chairman and party was attacked because of the 50-year fight for the total liberation of Africa and African people everywhere. The fact is, the centuries worth of struggle that we're going to be talking about is something that the chairman assumed responsibility for following the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 1960s, and even before then, as being engaged in the Black Power movement of the 1960s, witnessing this defeat by the US government, and then picking up the mantle and saying that, you know, this African revolution is going to be made, and took responsibility for that, and has built all of this subsequent 50 years of relentless leadership toward African redemption, is what the US government and FBI is attacking. So again, African people have always resisted the colonial assault on our people. We have fought the colonial mode of production built on our stolen labor, resources, and blood. And this has to be really understood, because Africans did not take this laying down. Africans did not come under colonial domination, being snatched away from our land and being ripped apart from our families, our whole people. This did not happen, you know, in a non-violent, process where African people just took it laying down, and has never been the case. African people have always fought against the colonizer, has always fought against colonial domination. So ever since we came into this process, we were forced into this process, African people have been fighting to reclaim our lives, our resources, our destiny. That is what African people have done. African people's resources were stolen, and our labor was created for life, created life for the white colonizers. And so we see this picture here, which, you know, perfectly sums up the colonial mode of production, how it was colonialism that gave birth to this parasitic economy that's known as capitalism today. It was, you know, the enslavement of African people and turning Africans into commodities for sale, the first commodity for sale of this economic system, and the theft of our resources that produces and reproduces life for the colonizer. So no longer are African people producing and reproducing life for ourselves, but this process for African people has now been interrupted by the colonizer, so that we now, everything that it is that we have, including our land and all of the resources that come with it, our labor, our genius, our skills, all of that is turned over to produce, you know, the ability for white people to, you know, have these lives that they have everywhere it is around the world. The reason why we see white people living in these conditions and African people living in the most humiliating conditions of poverty and despair, there's a direct relationship there. And it's because that poverty, that despair, this, ability to not being able to feed, clothe, and house ourselves is feeding somebody, is clothing somebody, is housing somebody in the white community. So this is the reality. And again, African internationalism has helped us to understand this. So African people, we were kidnapped, we were forcibly dispersed around the world to build wealth, prosperity for Europe and for white people. And wherever we have been dispersed, we are colonized, and we are one African people. They would have us calling ourselves by all kinds of names, and as based on the places and where we've been dropped off, they have created these borders that, you know, have created this division between African people. Can't even, in Africa itself, you know, all of these so-called countries preventing Africans from being able to you know, come together, unite. I mean, this is something that the colonizer, for the purpose of the colonial mode of production, has imposed on African people. But the reality is we are something like 2 billion strong as a people, as a nation. And the moment we can come to this conclusion that we are one African people, we don't see ourselves as just this minority population in this particular area in which we've been dropped off. We see ourselves connected to a people that's 2 billion strong, that overwhelms the colonizer population throughout the world. The African People's Socialist Party leads the struggle for African liberation until victory, not a piece of something. You know, there is no compromising on the total liberation of African people until it's won. It means that until African people have been able to seize our Africa, our resources, and have destroyed the colonial mode of production once and for all, that is what victory is for us. And that means making the African Revolution. And that's what the African People's Socialist Party has assumed they were tasked to do. So part one of this discussion, African resistance to European occupation and invasion in Africa. Africans fiercely resisted European colonial invasion. For instance, the Beja people of Sudan resisted European invasion since Roman times. So we'll talk about Queen Nzinga, who fought Portuguese assault on Angola. Queen Nzinga resisted the Portuguese invasion and enslavement of what is now called Angola. Nzinga made no concessions on the Portuguese slave trade and kidnapping of African people. In her 60s, Nzinga led an army that waged guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese. The white invaders never defeated her and died in her bed in the 80s. In her 80s, I'm sorry. Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa of Ghana. Yaa Asantewaa was a fierce fighter who raised and led an army of 5,000 against British colonizers. She is loved as a hero in Ghana today. The Zulu Wars of Southern Africa in the 1800s. Brilliantly defeated the British colonizers in Southern Africa in pitched battles. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. At Islandwana in South Africa, the Zulu fighters surprised the British imperialist occupation forces with a trained army of 20,000 African warriors who killed the majority of the British forces. Zulu fighters developed the war strategy called the Horns of the Buffalo and color-coded the warriors for their placement in the formation. And Zulus fought white colonizers for 100 years. The Matabele Wars in Zimbabwe in the 1890s. In Mbele, resistance fighters in Zimbabwe waged fierce resistance against British colonizers led by Cecil Rhodes. Africans armed themselves with rifles gained from killing the British invaders. However, the British used Maxim machine guns for the first time, slaughtering 1,500 Mbele fighters in a single afternoon. The Maji Maji Wars in Namibia. Maji rebellions were waged against German occupation and colonial rule in Tanzania, where the Germans submitted the African people to forced labor and committed genocide against the Nama and Herero people, the template for the murder of the Jews by Germans in World War II. Maji leaders murdered by Germans for heroic resistance. Part 2, African resistance in US under colonial enslavement. African people captive in the US fought the colonizer, resisted, and escaped daily. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. The Stono was the largest uprising of African people in the American colonies under England. African people staged several insurrections, seized arms, killed whites, and burned houses. Cut heads, burned houses, we know that saying. They raided a warehouse, executing the white owners and placing the white people's heads on the store's front steps. Moving on to other houses in the area, they killed the occupants and burned the structures. They marched towards St. Augustine, Florida, where under Spanish law, they would be free. They held their own against the British for more than a week. Gabriel's Rebellion, 1800. So Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, Gabriel, enslaved on the Prosser plantation in Virginia, was inspired by the African Revolution of Haiti. Gabriel sought to raise an army of 1,000 Africans who would march to Richmond with the slogan, "Liberty or death," and take the armory and the governor hostage. Gabriel and 25 other African people were hanged for their courageous resistance. Louisiana African Rebellion. So this was the root of the Louisiana Rebellion. It was inspired by the victorious African Revolution of Haiti, was the largest, most successful uprising of enslaved Africans in US history. Led by Charles Deslons, they took over a plantation and seized military uniforms, guns, and ammunition. They marched to New Orleans, gaining hundreds of followers, and fought a pitched battle with white soldiers. Telmak's uprising, Denmark-Vesey. So Telmak, Denmark-Vesey, the Vesey insurrection. Inspired by the African Revolution of Haiti, we're seeing a theme here, Telmak was a free carpenter. With other Africans, he plotted to kill colonizers of Charleston, South Carolina, and liberate the enslaved Africans. They planned to sail to Haiti. Nat Turner Rebellion, strike at night and spare no one. Nat Turner's rebellion drove fear into the white colonizers and their families. Turner and 70 armed African resistance fighters attacked 15 homes, killing 60 white people, including Turner's colonizer's wife and children. Turner eluded authorities for more than a month. Part 3, African resistance in South America and the Caribbean. In 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s was ongoing resistance to colonial slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean. Solitude was an African resistance fighter against the French army of Napoleon in the island of Guadeloupe while she was pregnant in 1802. She was hanged by the French after she had her baby. Wolof Rebellion of San Domingo against Diego and Columbus. Wolof Rebellion in San Domingo, enslaved Africans from the Wolof people rose up against Christopher Columbus's son on his sugar plantation in San Domingo and killing at least 9 white people. Most of the Africans escaped to the mountains where they formed independent Maroon communities with the indigenous people. The Maroon Wars of Jamaica. From 1655 to 1738, the British recognized they could not defeat the resisting Africans of Jamaica, known as the Maroons, who formed their own independent communities. The Maroons fought the British in well-organized attacks and raids on plantations. Nani, leader of the Maroons in 1722. Granny Nani was a Maroon leader, loved and recognized for her leadership and guerrilla warfare skills. Zumbi and the Palmares Wars of Brazil in 1600s. Independent Africans who had won and established their own self-governing towns in Brazil brilliantly fought the Portuguese colonizers. One of the heroic leaders was Zumbi, who waged almost constant war against some of the best Portuguese colonial armies during his lifetime. Part 4, African Revolution and Anti-Colonial Movements. The African Revolution of Haiti from 1791 to 1804, which we've seen had inspired so many different iterations of African resistance throughout the world. The Haitian Revolution was the first successful anti-colonial struggle in history that influenced African resistance and other anti-slavery and anti-colonial movements in the US and throughout the Caribbean and South America. Begun by Toussaint Louverture and completed by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, The victorious Haitian Revolution defeated Napoleon's imperialist army, the strongest army of its time, and established the first liberated African state in the world. In liberated Haiti, slavery was abolished by an African government. African and oppressed peoples from anywhere in the world were given safe haven in Haiti, and white people were prohibited from owning land. Over the years, Haiti was brutally attacked by the French and US imperialism while forcing Haiti to pay $90 million in pure gold to France. And we know that Haiti is still suffering as a consequence of its victory in 1804. So on our right, we have Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines on the left. Marcus Garvey Movement from 1916 to 1940. Marcus Garvey Movement, we see here the parade at the Convention of the Negro People of the World in New York in 1920. Marcus Garvey Movement developed the Black Star Line and had the audacity to organize at least 11 million Africans throughout the world under the slogan, Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. So Marcus Garvey came to New York from Jamaica in 1916 and established the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1917 in Harlem. In 1920, Garvey and the UNIA held the first international convention of the Negro people of the world at Madison Square Garden in New York. The convention was attended by 25,000 people, with contingents of African people from nearly every country in Africa, the Caribbean, as well as from throughout the US. The UNIA had a membership of 11 million African people around the world and was the largest African organization that has ever existed. The Garvey Movement owned the Black Star Steamship Line, supported by contributions from African workers worldwide. With the slogan, Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad, the Garvey Movement adopted the red, black, and green flag. The UNIA newspaper, The Negro World, influenced anti-colonial revolutionaries around the world, including Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam and Sandino of Nicaragua. The Mao Mao Rebellion in Kenya, 1952 to 1960. Mao Mao was the popular name of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, headed by Dedan Kimathi, who led the anti-colonial struggle against British colonialism in Kenya. The Mao Mao, the majority of whom were of the Kikuyu people, popularized the Swahili slogan, Uhuru. In retaliation, British white power waged a bloody counterinsurgency against the Kikuyu, murdering them, forcing them to live in a fenced-in open-air prison, hanging them and torturing them with broken glass, shoved into women's vaginas and men's anuses. The Mao Mao Kenyan Land and Freedom Army and Kikuyu people rounded up and tortured and killed by the British. Then we have the Black Revolution of the 1960s. Evolving out of the civil rights movement in the US South, the Black Revolution in the US was the dominant revolutionary movement in the US from about 1965 to 1973. The masses of African people in the southern states waged a powerful resistance in the 1950s and early 60s, fighting for basic civil rights to vote and to end the Jim Crow apartheid laws. The most influential organization of the early years was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was formed by Ella Baker in 1960 and organized African people throughout the South. And it's also something we should mention that Chairman Omali Yeshitela was a member of SNCC and had organized SNCC right here in the state of Florida. Malcolm X, a key influence of the Black Revolution of the 60s. Harlem-based Malcolm X was a leading figure of the early 1960s, representing Black nationalism of the urban African working class. And just want to note where he's from or where he was based in Harlem, where we see just previously the Garvey movement, having a really strong roots. When African rebellions and armed resistance swept the urban centers in the mid-60s, struggles inside of SNCC rose up, led by the African working class with the demand for Black power. African working class leadership built revolutionary organizations such as the Black Panther Party, led by Huey P. Newton, and JOMO, the junta of militant organizations led by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Progressive and revolutionary governments around the world hosted the representatives of the Black Panther Party. Governments such as the Vietnamese looked to the Black Revolution as allies as Vietnam fought the US government externally. The Black Revolution of the 60s was militarily defeated by the US COINTELPRO program, which assassinated our leaders and destroyed our organizations. And here's just some images of the Black Revolution of the 1960s, where you have the Capitol, the Black Panther Party storming the Capitol in California. But a precursor to this was when Chairman Omali Yeshitela tore down the mural in St. Petersburg City Hall, this mural that depicted Africans, in this white nationalist caricature. He tore that mural down, dragged it through the streets of St. Petersburg. And this happened on December 29th, 1966, which, was the first act of Black power in this country. So Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Africa must unite. Kwame Nkrumah in 1957 became the first president of independent Ghana, which had been under European occupation of colonial rule since the 1400s. Nkrumah struggled for a united, liberated, and socialist Africa. Nkrumah was the first president of the Organization of African Unity. Nkrumah was overthrown in a CIA coup while he was on a trip to China and Vietnam in 1966 and was exiled in Guinea-Conakry. Patrice Lumumba, Congo, 1960. Patrice Lumumba was elected Prime Minister of Congo on its independence from Belgium in 1960. During the independence ceremony, Lumumba courageously confronted the King of Belgium, making it clear that he represented the interests of the poor and working African people of Congo. Many say that historic speech signed his death warrant. Congo is one of the richest parts of Africa in its wealth of minerals and natural resources. After a few months in power, Lumumba was kidnapped, tortured, and ultimately viciously assassinated by forces from the US, England, and Belgium. The imperialists installed the brutal neo-colonialist Joseph Mobutu in the Congo and continued to control the vast resources there at the expense of the profound suffering and mass deaths of the people. Again, Patrice Lumumba was kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated by imperialist forces. And this is the type of punishment that is relegated to Africans who dare to struggle against the colonial mode of production. It's a very specific type of punishment that Africans have to come under as we fight for our liberation. The liberation struggle in Azania. The organized struggle of African people in South Africa dates back to 1912 with the founding of the South African Native National Congress, the precursor of the African National Congress. The Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania was formed in 1959 by Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe in response to the ANC's Freedom Charter, which called for the land of South Africa to belong to all who lived there, including the white settlers. In 1960, the colonial government opened fire on a people's protest in Sharpeville against the pass laws, slaughtering 69 African people. In 1960, the ANC and PAC were banned, and in 1961, the PAC formed POCO, its military wing, which began the armed struggle along with the ANC armed wing. Next. Okay. Revolution in South Africa. That's, we call it occupied Azania, which is, called South Africa today. So Mandela, the ANC, equals neo-colonialism. Imprisoned ANC leader Nelson Mandela was groomed by white power imperialism to lead a new neo-colonial government in South Africa, and ANC ceased the liberation war in 1990. In 1994, Mandela was elected president, where he immediately bowed down to the US government and disarmed the African population. The conditions of life for African workers under the ANC government are now worse than under apartheid. Africa must be united and liberated under the African working class. SWAPO and the struggle in Namibia. In 1966 to 1990, under the leadership of Sam Nujoma, SWAPO waged guerrilla warfare against colonial apartheid South Africa, which had been given the control of what is today Namibia. Revolution in Angola and Mozambique, 1960s to 70s. During the 60s and early 70s, armed forces of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola waged armed struggle. During the same years, the former colony of Mozambique also waged armed struggle against Portuguese colonialism, winning a negotiated independence in 1975. Samora Machel was the revolutionary leader of Mozambique and became its president. Machel was assassinated in a US orchestrated plane crash in 1986. Thomas Sankara and the struggle in Burkino Faso. Sankara came to power in a popular coup against the neo-colonial government of Upper Volta that was backed by imperialist France. Called Africa's Che Guevara, Sankara renamed the country Burkina Faso, land of the upright man. His foreign policies were centered on anti-imperialism, with his government eschewing all foreign aid, pushing for debt reduction, nationalizing all land and mineral wealth, and averting the power and influence of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Sankara worked to prevent famine with agrarian self-sufficiency and land reform, prioritizing education with a nationwide literacy campaign and promoting public health by vaccinating 2.5 million African children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. Sankara was assassinated by a US-backed coup in 1987. Part 5, the African Socialist International, uniting, liberating Africa and African people once and for all. The African People's Socialist Party, led by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, passed a resolution at the party's first Congress in September 1981 to build the African Socialist International. The ASI is the worldwide united organization of all national organizations of the African People's Socialist Party everywhere. The party's resolution sets the goals of liberating and uniting all Africa under a single all-African socialist state, uniting, coordinating, and giving general assistance and direction to the revolutionary struggles of all African people around the world, and achieving the consolidation of African nationality for all African people wherever we are oppressed and exploited throughout the world. The ASI is led by Secretary General Louisiana Kinshasa. So here we have the African Socialist International, its chair, Omali Yeshitela, and Secretary General Louisiana Kinshasa. And we are building the power to govern. And here we have the Black Power Blueprint, which is just, one of the magnificent, incredible, overextending projects of the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement over the past 50 years. The party has built the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa Defense Campaign, our counteroffensive to the FBI attack against our party, which an important point was made about this, that the attack didn't, just start on July 29th, that they had been building up for this attack. And so I mentioned how African internationalism, how this theory that has been authored by the chairman has been able to sum up the world the way it really is, has given us the blueprint towards our liberation. It's also solved all of the outstanding problems of the Black Revolution that contributed to our defeat, and has taken all of this and has built the African People's Socialist Party to take this centuries worth of African resistance and usher it to its final conclusion. And so this is why we have this defense campaign, this counteroffensive against the US government, who is attempting to, once again, as we've seen throughout this presentation, who is attempting to once again crush the ability for African people to win our liberation, to win our freedom, to destroy the colonial mode of production, to sever this relationship of colonizer and colonized, where somebody can live at the expense of African people, where the blood of Africa and African people can be sucked dry on a daily basis. So because African people, through the African People's Socialist Party, has dared to destroy that relationship, we have come under attack. But because we have African internationalism, this theory that arms the African working class, and because we have our own revolutionary party that will see to it the defeat of this colonial capitalist system, we have also the response to counterinsurgency attacks against our movement. And that's the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa Defense Campaign. And we'll talk more about that in terms of how you can become connected, involved, and support this effort. So forward to the African Revolution and build the African Socialist International, to which the history of African resistance is concentrated. One Africa, one nation, Uhuru. So that concludes this overview of the history of African resistance. And I appreciate everybody for staying with me as we went through this, but it was really important to define this discussion today. But there's somebody who can do a much better job at expounding on this. And that's none other than the leader of the African nation and the Worldwide African Revolution, which we'll introduce in just a moment. We're going to take a brief pause here to remind you to share this discussion far and wide, especially before we bring up the chairman. So remember to like and share this video no matter what platform you're tuning in from. And as you're liking and sharing, we're going to pause for some brief announcements. And then we'll go to our the keynote, the live presentation with Chairman Omali Yeshitela. So I'm going to bring up Comrade Mwezi, who is the administrative assistant to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, to deliver our announcements. Uhuru, Comrade Mwezi.
Uhuru, Comrade Director Akilé, I want to really appreciate that profound overview, and we'll begin with today's announcements. So stop the FBI attacks on the African People's Socialist Party and Chairman Omali Yeshitela. We invite you to join the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa Defense Campaign. Visit handsoffuhuru.org to sign the petition, to get updates, and to learn how you can get involved. And follow the campaign on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, @HandsOffUhuru. Next slide. The 2022 Days of Reparations to African People Speaking Tour, hosted by the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, calls on white people to stand in solidarity with the African community's right to advocate for, organize for their liberation and self-determination. The event will mobilize white people in opposition to the U.S. government's attacks on the African liberation movement. As Chairman Omali Yeshitela has stated, the stand for principled solidarity with the African working class-led struggle for socialism and reparations represents, quote, the first time in history, the way for white people to participate in genuine class struggle against the colonial capitalist system, end quote. This tour includes stops in Oakland, Portland, Philadelphia, St. Petersburg, Florida, and Minneapolis, and culminates in a national march for reparations and conference on October 15th and 16th in St. Louis, Missouri. For more information, visit uhurusolidarity.org. Uhuru, next slide. Join us on Saturday, September 17th in beautiful Clark Park for the 7th One Africa, One Nation Book Fair and Marketplace. This is in Philadelphia. This is free all-day program with live music, poetry, free education resources, giveaways, a children's circle, special activities for families, food, and over 100 plus marketplace vendors. We'll have, and they'll also have an evening with Chairman Omali Yeshitela after the market at the Uhuru Furniture Store in Philly. So check out the burningspear.com/events for more information. Uhuru, next slide. On November 5th and 6th, join the Black is Back Coalition for the 14th annual Black People's March on the White House in Washington, D.C. You can register for more information at blackisbackcoalition.org and sign the resolution. Uhuru. And make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and support the Omali Taught Me show by donating at paypal.me/Omali Taught Me. Uhuru Tours and Speakers Bureau is an institution of the African People's Socialist Party that coordinates events and tours for Omali Yeshitela and other party speakers and leaders. Book Omali Yeshitela and other Uhuru Movement speakers for your campus or your organization now. You can do this by emailing info@uhurutours.com or by calling 727-914-3621. And finally, we want to invite everyone to come off the sidelines and to join under the leadership of the African working class led by the African People's Socialist Party. Next slide. Or, well, I guess you can keep it here and I'll keep going here. So visit the APSP Uhuru and fill out our contact form, or type into the chat section that you want to become a member of the African People's Socialist Party. We have comrades in the chat section waiting right now to get in touch with you, or to get you in touch with somebody in your region or your local, committee. So go ahead and right now in the chat, put I want to join the APSP and go to apspuhuru.org/join. And no matter where you're located, for, African people, this is the organization for you. So again, type in the chat, I want to join APSP, and uhuru.org. And also continue to check out the burningspear.com/events for events that are coming up, and post your own events, Uhuru. And I will turn it back to you, Director Akilé.
Uhuru, Comrade Mwezi, thank you so much for delivering our announcements. And I failed to mention, she's not only the administrative assistant to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, she's also the chair of the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa Defense Committee. So Uhuru, Comrade Mwezi, I want to salute your leadership. Uhuru.
Thank you, Comrade. Uhuru.
Thank you. All right. So again, I want to salute the continued struggle for the liberation of Africa and African people. I want to say long live the African Revolution, and we are winning. And so now it is my honor to introduce the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru. I'd like to express my appreciation to you, Comrade Comrade Director Akilé Anai, and to all of you who are responsible for the production of the study, and also those who are responsible for pulling together that incredible African internationalist PowerPoint that was a part of the overview for this study. And I want to just remind everybody that this is a study, and the overview was a study. This is not one of the kinds of entertainment PowerPoints that often give us an opportunity to salute and celebrate this form of this resistance over here, this resistance over there, and something about either the courage of those who participate in the African liberation movement, or the despicable behavior, character, nature of the colonizer, something to that effect. The thing that this PowerPoint did was to show, among other things, that the struggle of African people has been relentless, that there has never been a moment in history that African people willingly participated in being dominated by foreigners and aliens, which is something that came about and was initiated in the most effective way to give birth to the existing social system in 1415 by Portugal, who initiated what was characterized, what came to be known later as the so-called slave trade, the trade in Black people, African people among Europeans. And of course, this was a fundamentally critical moment in history, because it began the process of the creation of a whole new world order. A world order different from that which had been experienced by the peoples of the world prior to that. Different from the world that was being experienced by African people who lived on the continent of Africa, who were able to participate in our own self-created, self-defined political economy. I mentioned political economy because the fact is that it is not possible for any society to exist without having an economy, economic life. This is the process through which human beings put our hands to nature and transform nature in a manner that gives us access to the ability to life. We transform things on the land, and we create the ability to feed, clothe, and house ourselves. This is what is recognized as economic activity and economy. So Africa had an independent economy, economic life, where African people participated not only in producing life, but participated in that part of the world where life itself, where human life itself originated. The statement, the thing that makes this significant, of course, is that what people now recognize as Africa and experience as Africa is that which have been provided to us by the colonizer, and we've been taught to believe that there's something natural and normal about the poverty, the violence, the imposed ignorance in Africa, where the truth of the matter is that human life itself began there. Therefore, Africa cannot be hostile to life. It's where life began.
And so if life is threatened on a regular and consistent basis in Africa, it's not because it's natural, because it's unnatural. Something has happened to Africa. So we're talking about a time where Africa was able not only to feed, clothe, and house itself, but was an example for the civilized peoples of the world. Africa brought civilization to the planet Earth, which is not a matter of bragging, it's a matter of recognition that if you are located, if you are the center of the emergence of human life, then human civilization itself would naturally, normally start in that place. And I'm just saying this again to defy any notion that somehow Africans were rescued from a state of bestiality, ignorance, and what have you by European intervention. And then this is different because we're talking about a time when there was no Europe. There was no such thing as Europe. There were impoverished, starving, brutally ignorant people who lived in this land space that we now know as Europe. And I was just recently reading. It's really important because the stories that have been fabricated explains to us how white people left Europe and went to Africa and these other dark and desolate places to carry out their responsibility to bring civilization and life and Christianity and things like that to us, the ignorant. And the truth of the matter is that Europe had no civilization to share with anybody. It had no resources to share with anybody. And this was the time that the Europeans have come to describe as the era of feudalism. This is how that era has now been described. And it's something that lasted for 1,000 years or so, totally impoverished, ignorant, backwards, unbathed, uncivilized part of the world. And it was impoverished to the extent that something I was just looking at the other day that said in the 1330s in England, that the economy was so bad and that the poor people were so bad off that they ate their dogs, they ate bird feces and their children. The poor people even ate their children. And I'm stating this again just to make an assault on this narrative that has been created to justify the colonization of Africa and other peoples around the world, which, according to the narrative, was something that white people did. And I say white people because this too was an invention, just like Europe became an invention, just like the Black people became an invention, that the social system that was given birth by enslaving African people and transferring African people against our will around the world and working us like beasts forever. This is a narrative that explains itself. You don't have a society born of this that says that the reason that we escaped eating our children and escaped eating bird doo-doo and dogs and impoverishment and ignorance is because we enslaved Africans. We stole the land of the indigenous people and pushed them into a state of just poverty and ignorance, et cetera. It doesn't explain itself that fashion. What it does is you see that a whole social system came into existence. African people captured. African people by this tiny backwards place in Europe, in what came to be known as Europe, what came to be known as Portugal, captured Black people, captured African people, worked us like beasts for nothing, and began a process of agriculture and other kinds of things, and began this process of around the coast of Africa, capturing human beings, capturing resources and what have you. And this is the thing that elevated Portugal and injected into what would become Europe, a consciousness of a group of people who before were simply seeing themselves as different and distinct ethnic groups, if you will, or tribes, now there's a growing consciousness, a sense of sameness, because they are pulled into the same economic process of capturing human beings and capturing human territories and earning their ability, or winning their ability to live based on that. This is the emergence of the social system that we're talking about. This is the emergence of a colonial mode of production. And this colonial mode of production was from its very inception parasitic. So Europe lived under what they have characterized as feudalism, but they never were able to say the same Europeans, the same Marx, the same Lenin, the same Engels, who did brilliant work in addressing certain features and sometimes with some scientific accuracy, did brilliant work there, but they were never able to, and looking at Marx and Engels and people like this who actually defined this concept of mode of production. They were able to say that feudalism was a mode of production with certain characteristics, and that Europe moved from feudalism, but they were never able to say that they moved from a feudal mode of production to a colonial mode of production, which is to say that Europe began to live then off of the resources of life and resources and future of other people, and specifically of African people, and then those indigenous people in the Americas whose lands were stolen from them, who were dominated and brutalized and have been dominated and brutalized up to this point. They never were able to say that. Well, we can say that. And this is part of what makes this PowerPoint that we've just looked at in terms of an overview to this discussion so significant, so powerful. And so what we've seen is from the very inception of the assault on Africa by Portugal, by others who became Europeans, and who captured a world economy which gave them the ability to define the world for itself in their own image. This process is the one that continues to dominate the world today, and it is a parasitic kind of relationship that has dragged the mass of humanity into it. So now you have the whole of humanity existing through this parasitic relationship. Now, especially since 1884-85, when the Europeans got together, around a table, a part of the feast that they would have in Berlin at this time was Africa itself. And at this table, they divided Africa into these untenable entities that they called countries. And they didn't call it countries, it was just booty. It was just stuff that was stolen from Africa, and was really important because Africa has always been significant to the rise, the birth of this existing social system that has been mischaracterized by, in many ways, as capitalism coming from feudalism. So here you have these Europeans who are sitting, carving up this territory. And the basis, the need for that, of course, was to prevent a war between Europeans over who was going to get what parts of Africa. So they said, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's do it like civilized people. We can do it over drinks and what have you. Let's have a rational discussion about who's going to get what part of Africa so we don't have to fight over it. And then in 1884 and 85, they carved up Africa without a single African being in the room, and shared it out to themselves. This was done in part to prevent them having to fight each other over it. And it was done also because Africa was so rich, so vast, with such resources, not just material resources, but human resources. And in terms of the science that came from Africa, stolen from Africa, in terms of knowledge, like agriculture, and architecture and other things like that, they stole it from Africa along with African human beings. This is a part of transforming the whole world. And so now you have this situation in 1884-85, they made these deals, they carved it up, they called these territories by different names. But not too long after that, we have the emergence of, we have struggles going on all along. There's never been a time where there were no struggles. There never was a time where someone was not trying to bring African people together to overturn this horrible relationship that's being defined by the oppressors, by the Europeans, in these noble terms that that explain the existence of Europe and the existence of Europeans and European philosophers and things like this. This was all of that philosophy, all of those cathedrals, all of those churches, and every religious and principle came in the wake and on the backs of this colonial domination of Africa and African people around the world. This is what this PowerPoint was helping us to understand and to come to grips with. So then, not too long after the Berlin conference, by 1914, we see the emergence out of Jamaica of an organization that would call itself the Universal African, the Universal African UNIA, in the Universal Negro, Improvement Association. And what this did most extraordinarily was pull together all of these Black people, all of these African people scattered around the world by this process that gave birth to and fed and continues to feed what we now know as Europe and the whole European social system, because it didn't just give birth to Europe, it gave birth to Jamaica. It gave birth to all of the colonists of what we now look at in terms of different territories and countries in South America. All of this process, and New Zealand, Australia, all of this came about as a part of the same process. And so, and out of Jamaica, this tiny island in Jamaica, came this remarkable personality and this remarkable organization, Universal Negro Improvement Associations and African Communities League. And it set out from Jamaica, set up in Harlem, New York, built an extraordinary, massive organization, the largest that I'm familiar with that's ever happened in the world, not just Black organization, but I don't know of any organization like that that preceded it. And this was the movement that pulled together the African world, and it unleashed a different kind of consciousness. It broke whatever was attempting to mature as these consciousness of being a part of these little entities that had been created by Europe, and gave African consciousness of Africa as the homeland of all Black people on the planet Earth. And on that Africa had come under assault. That Africa was being looted and robbed right before our eyes. And all these African people who were scattered around the world, creating wealth and value for the colonizers, who now define themselves as white people, and at the expense of those of us who are colonized. Garvey did this incredible thing. And people who sometimes call themselves Garveyites and friends of Garvey, they like to hold up Garvey as some great prophet, or they like to talk about Garvey in ways that do not recognize that Garvey was an extraordinarily anti-imperialist, and that the revolutionary forces around the world, and I say revolutionary, I'm talking about people who were engaged in struggle at this very same time. We're talking about a movement of Garvey, Ho Chi Minh attended meetings of Garvey in New York when he was a sea person, a seaman, as they characterize it, or something like that, traveling through New York. Then you had this same contemporary movement that was happening to colonize people around the world in Mexico, Villa, Zapata, contemporaries that existed in Nicaragua, the same countries that the United States is tussling with controlling right now, the same country that Trump and Biden and those who preceded them building walls to keep the people from their own territories. This is what we were looking at the time of Garvey. And so he was an extraordinary force, and he was electrifying the imagination of oppressed and colonized people around the world. The Mao Mao that would come into existence were influenced by Garvey. The movement in Cuba. I mean, we like to talk about the Cuban Revolution. Garvey had more branches in Cuba than in many other places around the world. So Garvey, the movement influence of Garvey, Malcolm X's parents were
members of Garvey's organization. And so I just think it's important to recognize that, as was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who became the leader of the original Nation of Islam. So you had this process, this movement of trying to, under Garvey, of pulling together an African revolution, an African response, Africa for Africans at home and abroad. That was the magnificent slogan. It was since that time that we've seen the consolidation of a consciousness of, and this happened and was consolidated in with the 1963 founding of the Organization of African Unity, which many people hold up to be this wonderful thing, but really was something that was facilitated by European colonial powers to cut off the work that was being done by Kwame Nkrumah to unite all of Africa into a single entity. And then, of course, what the Organization of African Unity did, one of the most important things that it did in this history was to actually refuse to unite, to push forth for an African, a united Africa, and actually encoded in its founding documents the justification, the recognition, the validity of the determinations, the borders that were created in Germany in 18 what was that? Say it again. No, it wasn't 1840. 1884 and 85. So this is what that thing did. So with that, then you had and Nkrumah fought viciously against that. And you can go and look at the presentation that Nkrumah made on May 24th, 1963, the day before the founding of the Organization of African Unity. And he predicted everything that we see happening with Africa today. He predicted this would occur if they did not leave that meeting where the OAU was founded, having recognized that the objective had to be one Africa, one Africa, one united Africa, not a whole bunch of little Africas, not regional Africans, but a solid African. This is what he fought for. And this is the basis of them finally. This was 1963, 1966, they overthrew Nkrumah. They were later, I'm convinced, killed Nkrumah. He died of some mysterious disease that nobody could understand, just like Arafat did, just like Hugo Chavez did, just like so many people who they did not kill with pre-dawn raids as they made against my home. So this brings the African People's Socialist Party into this process, because the African People's Socialist Party is the only organization since Garvey, and certainly more than 100 years ago, and certainly since Nkrumah, who attempted to unite Africa through this process in the mid 50s through the mid 1960s. The African People's Socialist Party founded itself recognizing an absolute total need for the unification of Africa and for the completion of the Black Revolution of the 1960s, how that revolution looked and how it made itself manifest in the 1960s, where it was a period of massive global anti-colonial struggle that saw major conferences happening around the world. In the 1950s, we saw the Bandung Conference. You will have heard Malcolm X speak about this, a conference of colonized people that happened in Bandung, Indonesia. You will recognize that in 1966, was it? 1962, 66, the Tri-Continental Conference that happened in Havana, Cuba, after the Cuban Revolution had occurred, and where African, Asians, South America, Africans and people in Africa, from Africa, Asia, South America had come together defining the struggle against colonialism. And then, of course, the United States killed many of the people who were involved in that, overthrew several of the governments that were leaning in that direction and pushed it back. So we had this huge
movement of colonized people determined to be free from this foreign and alien domination that had been imposed on them, that created this world economy that dominates the world today, has dominated the world for a very long time. And that's the basis for the attack on July 29th of this year against the Uhuru Movement and the African People's Socialist Party, because not only have we followed in the historic tracks of the preceding movements, but we've elevated that. And we've created things that did not exist before. It's a clearer class consciousness. And for example, Nkrumah did not even understand and admits to the class question until after he was overthrown. And none of them had the advantage of having pulled together a new front of the African Revolution from among the colonizers themselves. Which is something the African People's Socialist Party has done, which is why they didn't simply attack an African community in St. Louis on July 29th, but they attacked the headquarters that we had established for the Solidarity Front of our party in a white community in South St. Louis, where, you know, the party has created hundreds of organizers in hundreds of cities, in more than 100 cities, and more than 30 states in the United States of white people, colonizers, fighting against colonialism, fighting not just against colonialism in some abstract way, but fighting for Black power in all of these places. So this is some major transformation. And at a time of severe crisis of the rotting, filthy, foul social system, because you can't have any social system that is anything but rotting and filthy and foul that's based on slavery and colonialism. That's the only thing that you can have. And so now this system is fighting for its life. And African people have now been positioned again in terms of our own consciousness, in terms of now we have our own theory that helps to consolidate this vast army of African people who are colonized around the world, give it a theoretical consolidation, gives it an understanding, it gives it some coherence now. So it's not a movement in Haiti, it's not a movement in Jamaica, it's not a movement in Somalia, it's one full movement that is informed by African internationalism. That's the theory that gives it coherence. We have created the organization that gives it an actual capacity to fight for and wield political power. And these are some of the things that have come about as a consequence of the rise of the African People's Socialist Party. Again, at a time where you see a complete deterioration of the colonial mode of production that came into existence. You see even more contests happening with various forces. Where it's becoming clear that Africa continues to be the center of this world. There's not a single modern economy on the planet Earth that could survive without the resources coming from Africa. Not a single one. Every modern economy on the planet Earth requires resources coming from Africa. And the thing that stands between the ongoing capture of those resources is the African people ourselves, especially those of us who have the political education, the theory, the organization in order to fight for our Africa. So that's really what happened on July 29th. That's why we were attacked. And that's why we must never betray the responsibility that we've voluntarily taken onto ourselves. And we help the world to understand that Africa will never bow again. Not willingly, not voluntarily Africa will never bow down again. Africa will be free. And for the first time in 100 years, it has a coherent leadership, a coherent theory that unites this revolutionary movement. And it has demonstrated over the last 50 years a relentless determination to see the liberation and redemption of Africa and African people. Uhuru.
Uhuru Chairman, really want to appreciate just your overall intervention into the overview that was given around the history of African resistance and want to unite with it. And also just want to say that the comment section are blowing up with just your praises and just recognizing your leadership and your contribution to the overall struggle for the freedom of African people. And that, as you stated, with African People's Socialist Party and the theory of African internationalism, this is something that can be achieved in your lifetime and in our lifetime. And I just want to unite also that it means that we see this history of African resistance and the struggles that African people have been engaged in since this whole colonial mode of production came into existence. And that when we see that history and we recognize our role and our place in making this revolution and completing this revolution and freeing African people, that it's something that we absolutely cannot betray. So I just really want to appreciate everything it is that you've brought to this discussion, and also want to again just acknowledge how forces are seeing you, recognizing your leadership in this whole process. So thank you so much, Chairman. And we want to go ahead now into the question and answer period, which
comment before we go there. It's a point that I think is really important, because there's this fabrication that's being put forth to justify continuing murdering Black people and keeping us as some state of slavery, that we are hirelings of Russia. I want to make this point because I think it's important. At our first Congress of the African People's Socialist Party in 1981, we passed a resolution to create the African Socialist International. That is to say, to unite the whole revolutionary movement of Black people around the world in the struggle for socialism. And the organizational, and we passed a resolution to give that organizational practical existence and presence throughout the African world. And one of the things that informed us, that instructed us that we had to do this, is because the Communist International, under the leadership of Soviet Union, had declared that there were only 6 authentic African revolutionary organizations in the world. Communist Russia had said that. 6, the authentic 6 is how they were referred to. And this authentic 6, they would give resources to, they would give training to, ideological, military, political training, and things like that. And there were other organizations, like at the time ZANU, and like the time the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, who were left out of that authentic 6, but who were important because they talked about taking Africa and uniting Africa, etc. And the politics were not necessarily that perfect. I mean, there was another organization, ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, that was left out of that. And China, in many instances, supported some of the others. But the thing for us, for me, was a recognition that nobody should be able to determine who was authentic in terms of the African Revolution except us. Africans had to do that, 1. 2, I was convinced that even though Africans collectively or in individual places are worse off than in some other places, that collectively we do have resources. We can pool monies together. We can pool our genius together. We can train each other and do all those other things. And then we can guarantee that the direction we're going in is one that favors our interests and not necessarily a direction that suits the particular objectives of any other power in the world, whether that's Soviet Russia, or whether that's Portugal, or whether that's South Africa, or any other force. And I want to make a point. We're not putting Soviet Russia and Portugal and the South African apartheid regime in the same category, but we are seeing that no one should have had the ability to provide leadership and direction for Africa except Africans. And in fact, that is what inspired the slogan that came out of Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe African National Union, that we are our own liberators. We are our own liberators. So I want to say that, that we are not fighting to end domination by one foreign power to surrender to any other power. Our struggle is for the total, unconditional, absolute, unequivocal liberation of every square inch of the continent of Africa, all of the African people globally into a single process under the leadership of the African working class. So I just wanted to make that comment because I think it's important in the context of them bombing my house and saying they're doing it because I'm some servant of Russia. The fact is they know that I won't be a servant for any damn body, and the party won't be, and the Uhuru movement will not be a servant for anybody. That's the real problem that they have. Uhuru, Comrade Director.
Uhuru Chairman, I just really appreciate that and want to unite. And, I think as we talked about, having to mention this whole FBI assault in the context of this history of African resistance, that, this is something that is recognized that the African People's Socialist Party is, the vehicle in which Africa is exercising its own voice and exercising its own, struggle for total liberation. And so, this is something that the U.S. government has recognized, the African People's Socialist Party, and as you stated, that it has identified its 3 strategic enemies, and Africa being at the center of this question. So just really, really want to appreciate that intervention, and want to go to the questions that are coming in from the online audience, and also state where people are viewing from. If you have a question for Chairman Omali Yeshitela and you haven't gone ahead and typed it into the chat section, make sure you do that on Facebook, YouTube, or on Zoom. You can pose a question right now in the chat section. So people are viewing from, we have Montreal, Canada, Kenya, Jacksonville, Florida, Marion County, Georgia, Fort Myers, Florida, Brooklyn, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, Fargo, North Dakota, occupied Azania or South Africa, San Diego, California, Gainesville, Florida, Battle Creek, Michigan, Moorhead, Minnesota, St. Petersburg, Florida, Oakland, California, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Illinois, Huntsville, Alabama, Tampa, Florida, and Boston, Massachusetts, all checked in with us today. So thank you, comrades, for tuning in everywhere it is that you are located. So Chairman, this first question is coming from Comrade Director Tafari in occupied Azania. He's asked, Uhuru Chairman, I would like to ask a question right away. How has the class struggle manifested itself throughout this history of anti-colonial resistance? For example, Louverture and Dessalines, Du Bois and Garvey, the founding of the ANC in 2012 as a neo-colonial organization after the crushing of the 1906 Bambata Rebellion, and today with resurgence of the mass resistance of African people.
Uhuru, thank you, Comrade Tafari. This question about neocolonialism and class struggle is extremely important. And one thing that happens is we don't understand the issue of the colonial mode of production. We can find ourselves fighting basically for improvements within the existing system, even though we might call ourselves fighting for socialism or fighting against capitalism. But Marx himself was able to say that this thing that we call wage slavery in Europe, or capitalism in Europe, required as a pedestal, slavery pure and simple. So the capitalist activity that the Europeans were able to recognize that was occurring, it happened on the base, it happened on an economic base of colonialism. So you can find yourself engaging in what you call class struggle on that base. And actually what you're doing is fighting for better rights and privileges, struggle for who's going to get most of the resources that come from this colonial relationship that the system has with African people. And Black people do that too. African people have done that, and Vietnamese have done that, and other people who've considered themselves engaging in a struggle against capitalism or for communism or socialism have done so without recognizing that the colonial mode of production is the foundation for everything. So sometimes people engage in these struggles, and it's like trying to get out of a hole with a shovel by digging more and more in the hole, and you never go any place, you know. And so that's one of the contradictions that we're confronted with. Secondly, one of the contradictions is that we've accepted the definition of the world as it is by the colonizers, and these borders that we live in. And so we become Zimbabweans and South Africans and Haitians and Black Brits and all these other things. And we're looking for a space there. But whatever Brit you're talking about, Black or white, exists and benefits from a relationship to the colonialism. And so if you're not talking about destroying colonialism, you're just looking for advantage again, sitting atop the foundation of the oppression of Africans and the peoples around the world. So the class struggle, what we've said all along is, in the final analysis, when you talk about class struggle, you're not talking about what this contest that exists among white people for a better position, or who's going to get most resources. That's what happened in Berlin. That's what that was about. Who's going to get what from colonized people. And that gets sharper and prettified as sometimes in the name of fighting for socialism or communism. But if you're not talking about overturning the colonial base of the society, that's all you can hope to get is better resources, more resources from colonialism, whether you're Black, whether you're white, however you characterize yourself. So we say that in the final analysis, the class question is concentrated in the colonial question, the colonial issue. It's the contest between colonialism and white power, that's the political expression of it, colonialism, and the colonizer and the colonized. This is where the fundamental contradiction lies. And so this is the essence of the class struggle. You're not just, and to say this, what we're looking at, again, is the profound contradiction. The whole world is between oppressed and oppressor nations. It's the main contradiction. We're not saying other contradictions do not exist. We're saying this is the main contradiction. We're saying that the other contradictions that exist in the world have their basis in this contract, this contradiction, between oppressed and oppressor nations. And they get their energy, their life, their definition, their significance by this. So you can do with all the other contradictions and still leave this contradiction between oppressed and oppressed nations in place, and you haven't gone anywhere. It's like being on a treadmill. You can turn it up as fast as you want to go, and you can get a sweaty, and you can pass out on the treadmill, and you haven't gone a damn place. And that's what it is when we look at trying to fight the class question without recognizing that it is concentrated in the colonial question. It is colonialism as the fundamental question. There's no such thing as some white working class fighting to liberate itself from capitalism by overthrowing the bourgeoisie. The real contradiction is the colonial question, and the only way you can get there is destroying the colonial mode of production. So that's part of what I would say. And then part of what happens, of course, is that this system, what it has done, it does allow a sector of the African population, of the colonial population, to get a better existence from colonialism than the vast majority of the others of us. These are people who manage the system in many instances. Like a lot of people try to figure out in the United States why African people can't get a quality education, as they would characterize it, if they were possible to get a quality education under their system. And why so many people are pushed out of schools. I read, I think something like 21% or 26% of the Africans in Pinellas County, Florida, males only graduate. And it's less than that, and I think, if I remember correctly, in New York. And so all these Africans are getting pushed out of school. And the fact is, they're not getting pushed out because they're stupid or dumb or anything like that. It's because they're less malleable. It's because they're resistance of a certain sort, that they characterize this resistance as defiance. They got a category to deal with our children they call defiance and things like that. So they get pushed out of school. And the only thing that, for the most part, the survivors of this process are the Obamas. Those people who are malleable, those people who were toe to line, those people who they want to put in place to be in charge of the rest of us. And that's the kind of process that we're living with. And I know that you asked something probably for more specifics than what I just laid out, Comrade Tafari, But that's a general kind of response that I can give to you, and I hope it was not totally unsatisfactory, Uhuru.
Uhuru, Comrade Director Tafari, you can indicate in the chat section, but I want to appreciate, Chairman, your response to this question. And we're going to move to Comrade Farrell, whose question is, Uhuru, Comrade Chairman, I salute you and I salute you in awe and honor, respect. Question, I know that the Bandung Conference was, of course, what it was, but could you elaborate on its overall program and how it tried to connect the struggle of colonized people? I think it was definitely a great thing and something that should be replicated in our time in the common fight against these global enemies of humanity. Your thoughts, please.
I can't give you its overall program. I can just tell you that it was a conference that was held in Indonesia. It was either 54, 55, something like that. And colonized peoples from around the world attended that conference. I mean, Chou En-la from China was at that conference. And I'm not sure if Nkrumah was there or not, but a lot of different colonized people came to that conference. Doesn't mean that they were all revolutionaries in the sense that we understand this question of revolution, though they were revolutionaries in the sense that they represented a real threat to the existing colonial mode of production. They were really a threat. And I can say that about them. And you've heard Malcolm X speak about the Bandung Conference, about how all of these people got together from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and how the only one couldn't come to the conference was the white man, right? And was the colonizer. That's what Malcolm X was talking about. So this was an anti-colonial program that they tried to consolidate. And we saw that continue to morph over the years of different iterations of Bandung happen. Different groupings came together throughout this process. The greater maturation of a certain kind of political and philosophical consciousness, even among the people who were fighting against colonialism, and which is part of what led ultimately to the Tri-Continental Conference that occurred in Cuba, Havana, Cuba. I've forgotten whether it was 62 or 66. Somebody can refresh me on that. And they put together, that was a fantastic event, a fantastic conference, and some really great stuff came out of that for a while until the imperialists were successful in breaking it up and using economic and other kinds of power and influence. They did that. In fact, one of the key persons for that conference couldn't make it because he had been assassinated in France. He was, I think, maybe from Tunisia. I can't remember, or Algeria or someplace, but he had been assassinated and couldn't even make it. I think it may have been Tunisia. I think they had wanted to do it in Algeria prior to the assassination of this comrade. So my memory is not that concise, comrade, in terms of Bandung, but it was a historic moment. And I think it's really important to recognize what it represented was that nobody was satisfied living under the boot of white power. And that you can't take all of people's resources and their future and the future of their children, et cetera, without using extreme kind of violence. So people were always plotting, always scheming, like a Nat Turner who would meet out in the dark and, and get whatever followers he could under the guise of, some kind of Christian revivals he was having, or whether it was like the comrades in Algeria, who were pulling together to try to get rid of the French. The fact is that there's always a plot, always a scheme going on, which is why they attack our houses at 5 o'clock in the morning, because they know that the oppressed is always trying to find a way to end that oppression and exploitation. And that's what Bandung was about. All the peoples around the world. This was not the Communist International. It was Bandung. These are people from all around the world, from various places who were living under colonial domination. That's what the Tri-Continental Conference in Havana was about. And these conferences are happening around the world. Oppressed people do get together when it's possible and look for how we can collectivize our efforts so that we can win our freedom and liberation. That's why I was in Ireland during the time of the so-called Troubles, when British colonialism, which had dominated Ireland for 800 years. First time I've ever seen white people who live like Black people do in the United States was when I was in Ireland. Couldn't believe it. And the terror that was visited upon those people by the British there. The British was a colonial power. The British was one of the colonial powers that attacked Russia in 1918, following the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution that was pushed into significance and the surface by the anti-colonial revolution that was happening all around the world. So anyway, comrade, I don't have that much memory of the specifics of Bandung, except to say that it was a part of a whole historical trajectory that was really exploding during this time in history. And I would also remind you that Bandung happened. Garvey was jailed in something like 1925. He was expelled from this country. And Bandung happened, less than a generation or so after that. So there was tremendous activity among oppressed people and colonized people globally. And what you are doing in your community right now, organizing for our freedom, organizing to attain a minimum of democracy to advance the struggle. What you are doing right now is a part of that history that was shown in this overview that we're looking at, and it's natural and normal for you as the oppressed to engage in getting rid of the oppression of our people and this relationship that we have with them. And it's normal for the oppressor to do every damn thing possible to crush it, to make sure that we never stand up to our full stature as a people, and that they can continue to bleed us and steal our birthrights and all of our resources. This is a struggle that's been going on for a long time, and that overview should have helped us to recognize that and understand some aspects of it. Uhuru, I know it's a long response, comrade, about Bandung.
Uhuru, Chairman. Well, it was a necessary response. I want to thank Comrade Farrell for raising it. And just to say, when we talk about this FBI attack and just the absurdity of the basis, the claims that they have made, I mean, we see this history of the African Socialist Party, how you have traveled, throughout the world to pull this whole revolutionary project together. And as you mentioned, you've been in Ireland and Nicaragua and, throughout Europe, in Africa, all, in the Caribbean, all of these places throughout the world to pull this whole revolutionary project together. That was you, an African who had, taken that task on. So I just wanted to make note of that as well. And Comrade Kumba said that the Tri-Continental in 1966 was called Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And also Comrade Matsamela has linked in the chat an episode around Black Power Talks, which is the 55th anniversary of the Battle of Algiers, Anti-Colonialism, Revolutionary Film, and Afro-Asian Solidarity. So you guys can all check that out. So thank you, Comrade Farrell, for your question. I'm going to read two comments, Chairman. One's coming from Sharna Lex on YouTube. Comments, Omali greeted me as an African last week. It was the first time I had been met with that, and it made my heart twitch like I was flexing a muscle I didn't know I had. Comrade Paul comments, when you were speaking about Karl Marx and Lenin in particular, says, true, Chairman, even great thinkers have institutional biases, and they were not the only ones. It happens in science too.
Yes, it does. Thank you, it does. And that's the thing about this whole thing is that Marx and Lenin and Engels probably would have been in front of everybody challenging this whole deification. That's, they actually tried to implement and a whole understanding of dialectics and et cetera. And it would not have allowed them to be locked into this place. That's why there's not it's not a Hegel, Marxism, Lenin, et cetera, because they said Hegel is the one who taught them about dialectics. They said others taught them about this and that. That was their perspective, but all of them learned on the basis of colonialism. And this is not pejorative that I'm using to define Marx or Engels or or Lenin, it's a statement of the objective relationship that they had to the process of history and to their own development. And it is they who, more than anybody else, Marx specifically, did a splendid job in talking about how consciousness is a product of a material reality. It's not the consciousness that creates the reality, it's the material reality that creates consciousness. And he talked about the relationship between the economic base of society and the thoughts, the ideas, the ideology, the culture, et cetera, that stems from that and reinforces that. And so to be so stupid that you would, I'm sorry, I don't mean to say stupid, I'm being insulting now, and that was not my intent, but at this moment, it wasn't my intent. But the thing is that, people, who, self-proclaimed, geniuses and wise people, et cetera, make these statements. That's really offensive because some people believe them and follow them based on that. And the fact is that Marx and Engels and Lenin, who made serious contributions, I believe, to how society could be understood, but they were themselves products of their location in history, their location within a particular political and social construct. They're products of that. And the fact of the matter is, we have talked in the past about how it is the colonizer who has always been the subject of history, and those of us who are colonized have been objects of history. What that means concretely is that if you were in Mississippi and 14 years old and a white woman said you whistle at her, they can kill you. You don't have a right to say any damn thing. White people have this discussion among themselves, by themselves. The rest of us were not involved in the discussion. When Marx and Engels were debating this and that, and Lenin debating this and that, we're not part of that discussion. We're not saying that doesn't reflect the reality that we live with. And now that we are re-achieving a capacity to speak for ourselves, some people who have only heard speech from colonizers, no matter how brilliant they may be, find what we are saying as being extraordinarily difficult to unite with and sometimes to comprehend. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you. And that was, in response to the comment that Comrade Paul had made. So thank you, Paul, for that comment. Thank you, Chairman. And some of the things I pulled from this, one, when we talk about Marx and how you've stated how the situation, and you see the world a lot differently when you're the one that's burning on the stove, when this is your situation versus the person who's looking at, the pot boiling, so this is, that helps to explain it. And also when you mentioned how material reality informs consciousness, and, you criticized a statement, I think, therefore I am, a while ago. I think it's related to, so thank you, Chairman. All right, so we're kind of winding down in time, and let me see. I don't know, Chairman, if you want to address this. This is something that is like a recent development, and I think it does speak to the serious existential crisis that the colonial mode of production and the whole white world is finding itself in. And this person was interested to know, Sister Deborah on YouTube asked, why not a speech on the colonial history of the deceased queen and her monarchy/empire?
Well, I forgot to tell you, when I was telling you about our position on Russia back at the time, the Soviet Russia, who we appreciated for everything that they did, and had problems with some things, but when I joined the US military as a young person who had concluded that the hell I was catching in this little city in St. Petersburg, Florida, had to do with the fact that I was in St. Petersburg, Florida, in this small southern town, and that if I can get the hell out of there, it would be a different situation. So I ended up joining the U.S. Army, join the Army and see the world kind of thing. And it didn't take long, really didn't take long. I mean, it's just a matter of days, before this notion was swept away from me. But the fact is that, what was the question that the comment was raising with us? Yeah, the Queen.
Yes.
When I was in Berlin, Germany, and the American soldiers, by which I mean white soldiers, there were different clubs and bars and things like that that were frequented by Africans and by Americans. And the American soldiers would love to go into the bars and clubs in Berlin, which was occupied by French, American, and Russian troops. They would go into these bars and they would say, "F the Queen," right? And so, I mean, you would have this fights all over the damn place, but, just in terms of this venerated old white woman, which is what she was a venerated old white woman. But because the colonial mode of production dominated everything in our consciousness, all kinds of people, especially young women around the world, found themselves dreaming of one day, like the Queen and the princess and that other woman who they murdered because she had been impregnated by this Egyptian lover, Diana, and they were a part of a whole history of looting African people. Somebody was telling me, I did an interview just the other day, and this African was saying how one of the jewels in the crown of the Queen that came from, was it South Africa? Was the biggest diamond, and it was worth, I've forgotten how many millions and millions of dollars that she wore on her head. And these are bloodsuckers. Colonialism is a blood-sucking process. And the Queen had her lips locked on the biggest, most lucrative orifice from which the blood of the colonized could be secured. And there's no way to get around that question. And you can romanticize it all the hell you want to. But like I said the other day, I don't have any tears for that venerated old white woman. That we have too many tears that we've cried for victims of that old white woman. And you got to remember, this old white woman, when she learned that she had ascended, if you will, to the position of Queen, I think she was in Kenya. There's somebody in this meeting who's in Kenya now. And under, with her, that was 1952, I think it was. And the British, under her nominal leadership, murdered thousands. They perhaps killed 300,000 Black people in Kenya at that time. And I'm supposed to be finding, something to venerate about this white woman. I think her death really is important in terms of this moment in history, because she may very well be the last royal force in England. She may represent, her death, I think, is symbolic of the death of a whole social system. So no tears here. And there are people who will be horribly offended because all of the white world is raising up this woman for people to salute and hold up and wonderful. And this is a form of struggle to deepen patriotism toward colonialism. So all of the colonized, to be kissing, the ring at minimum of the Queen and colonizer, and she's always given us something to kiss, but in most instances it hasn't been her ring. So we ain't kissing no more, and we ain't crying no more. And I know this comrade in Kenya knows exactly what I'm talking to, because I don't think there's anybody, or there are very few people in Kenya who did not lose somebody to the vicious murder of the British colonizer, the tea-sipping, genteel British colonizers. You know, that's the reality that we are dealing with, and that's the reality that's now begun to penetrate the narrative of the colonizer, not just as it relates to England, but the whole world. More and more people, colonized people, regaining our voice and our capacity to speak to our own reality. And this, by the way, represents the most significant evidence of the death of a social system. It's on the way out, and the colonized are on the way up. That's what we refer to as an uneasy equilibrium. That the history is a contradiction, a contest between the past of slavery and colonialism and the future of a liberated peoples around the world. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. In fact, you stated that this is the period of the ascendancy of the slave. So Uhuru, thank you, Chairman, for those statements, and thank you, Deborah, for raising that question. Chairman, we do have to wrap up, but there was a question that came in, and I think it's really important for us to deal with because one, I think it has real significance in this whole discussion of the history of African resistance. Solving the problems of the African Revolution has really important significance in this recent attack, but also because our party, our movement is receiving a lot of attention, and there are a lot of new forces who are participating in this study, who are learning about the Uhuru movement by way of being in this study. So I thought it would be important to talk about, opens up the chance to talk about the solidarity movement. And this question has come from the username Kambuyi Black on YouTube, who says, why is the party moving with Caucasians? How does the party maintain being pro-Black and an interracial party? Can the party promise its own security from within?
Well, the only thing I can say, it wasn't a Caucasian that killed Malcolm. It wasn't a Caucasian that actually shot Garvey. This is not to try to minimize or liquidate the horrible historical crimes committed against African people by white people, the colonizer, who has not only who's benefited from our oppression and exploitation for the longest period of time, but also who have achieved the spiritual benefit of a presumption of greater civilization, beauty, and wonder, and all of this kind of stuff. So there's been both material and spiritual, psychological benefits to white people stemming from the oppression, exploitation of African people. But it's not their whiteness that did it to us. And that's the thing, is that it's recognition of the nature of the social system itself, and how human beings get their living is basically responsible for most of what we think and how it is that we act. And the fact is that when the US government and other colonizers were killing African people and destroying our revolution around the world and inside the United States, we didn't run and we didn't retreat. I mean, or certainly we didn't run in some kind of reckless retreat. What we did was open up a new front for the African Revolution. This is just concrete, and that new front was among the colonizers themselves. And just like I mentioned to you about the people who killed Malcolm and committed other kinds of offenses against us, I could tell you, I can go to Mobutu, I can go to Papa Duvalier. These were white power in blackface. And they were able to do that because they had provided material benefits and ideological basis for these Africans to carry out the goal and interests of white power. It is absolutely insidiously backwards for African people to ignore the existence of white people, or to simply categorizing white people as the enemy, in a way that does not recognize that that they exist, and that we have to find a way to deal with that reality that favors the revolutionary project. I mean, why have homosexuals in the movement? Why have women leaders? I mean, all of these things have been something that we've been criticized for as the African People's Socialist Party. And our position about that has been that we refused to permit the oppressor to be able to divide us as Africans based and the African working class based on sexual orientation or gender. We refuse to allow them to prevent us from winning forces from in their own ranks who, in terms of where they are located, to the side of the African Revolution. People have asked me and say, well, do you trust the white people? And that you just don't get it, because that's never been the question for us. I don't know you, comrade, and I wouldn't base a relationship with you on trust. What I do trust is our philosophy. What I do trust is our analysis. What I do trust is our strategy. I don't know what kind of employment you have, if you have any, comrade. You may be fortunate enough just to work for yourself and not have to work at all. But the fact is that the colonizer will actually hire African people to work in their banks and to work in their supermarkets and department stores, et cetera, not because they trust us. Not because they trust us. There hasn't been any trust that you have given them. In fact, they'd be crazy to trust you. But they recognize, they trust their own process. They trust their own system. They trust their capacity to be able to identify when something goes wrong and to punish it when it does go wrong. The fact is that the people who, so I just wanted to say that. And that we've had enemies. There's no doubt in my mind that there are agents in the party now. And there have been agents in the past, provocateurs and things like that, who ruined the reputation or tried to of the African People's Socialist Party and the African Revolution. And there's no way we can prevent agents from coming into our movement. But the one thing that we can do is when they come in to make sure they work their asses off. And so for the revolution. So we're not guided by what we might call race nationalism or something to that effect. I think that we don't believe that there's a racial analysis or biological basis for the oppression and exploitation of the peoples of the world and for African people ourselves. We don't look for a biological basis for that oppression and exploitation. And we are historical materialists, and we recognize that the basis for that is to be found in the economic social system itself. That has, for the longest period of time, favored white people at our expense, and then made it possible for white people to benefit from our oppression and our exploitation. If we can get white people to work to undermine and to destroy that system, that's fine with me. They say that I was employed by the Russians, and that's why I do what it is I do. That's what I've heard most recently from these charges that's been alleged against me and several other people in our movement. And the thing I'm saying is that the white people who work under our leadership are employed by the Black Revolution. And when I say employed in this instance, I should better say deployed, because it's not a matter of them getting paid to do this any more than I get paid to do it. We have a revolution to make. We have a world to free, along certainly with African people being in the center of that world, as we have always been since the founding of this social system. I've overtalked it, Comrade Director, but I thank you for the question, brother. I want us to continue having that discussion. More and more we will have to have that discussion because we have to find science and allow science to inform the revolutionary activity that we're involved in, just as it has to inform our philosophy. So thank you so much. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. And I just want to say that the success of this strategy and your analysis can be found in the history of the existence of the Solidarity Committee that was founded in 1976, and that exists up to this date. So, that is science. That's, material evidence of this successful strategy that you set out in 1976 with the founding of the African People's Solidarity Committee. So
the success can also be found in the fact that the United States government, when they attacked us at 5 o'clock in the morning in St. Louis, had to attack those white people at 5 o'clock in the morning in St. Louis. It's the same, it's what it is. It's Che Guevara, sharing the same fate, whether in victory or death. There are Negroes who will not share the same fate, who are not going to do anything. They're not going to do any work. In fact, they will find all kinds of reasons not to do any work with them Caucasians being part of it. Mm-hmm. So sharing the same fate in victory or death, that's what it is that we're talking about.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much. And as we wrap up, do you want to say anything else for closing remarks, or are you good?
Just go to handsoffuhuru.org. Everybody should be gearing up for November 5th. We're going to Washington, D.C. strong. Everybody, November 5th, Washington, D.C. Uhuru,
Chairman. I really want to salute the brilliant leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and send a huge thank you to all of you who are tuning in, and also to this incredible production crew that puts Omali Taught Me, the Omali Taught Me show together each week, and to make sure that you are getting to Washington, D.C. for November 5th to march on the White House. Make sure you go to blackisbackcoalition.org, and also a reminder to join and support the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa campaign. And you can do that by going to handsoffuhuru.org. And just as African resistance has occurred throughout history, so has the colonizers' efforts to keep us from achieving our freedom. This time, our struggle will result in a permanent defeat to the colonial mode of production. Make sure to follow the chairman on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Hands off Uhuru, hands off Africa.
Hands off Africa. Uhuru.
Uhuru.